Shalom. Welcome to Through the Book of Galatians. This is a follow-up to Through the Book of Romans. It'll be helpful if you've watched and understood the Through the Book of Romans video teaching class in 5 parts, I believe, before you try to study through the book of Galatians. Now, you can still study through the book of Galatians without it, but it'll be very helpful for you to first go through the book of Romans. And this is through a series that I hope to cover all of the Pauline epistles, and if time allows, all of the Ketuvim, Nazarene, and perhaps other books of the scriptures as well. But the reason that Romans and Galatians are so closely tied together is because, as I understand the books anyway, I see 2 kinds of Pauline epistles, perhaps 3. The primary kind, there's one kind of Pauline epistle that is a primary foundational book or work of theology that Paul writes. This would be a book like the book of Romans or the book of Hebrews, just to give a couple of examples. And in these cases, Romans and Hebrews being prime examples, I believe these are books that Paul wrote as an exposition, an essay, if you will, on certain aspects of theology in a very formulatic way. And I believe that these were sent out to assemblies all over the known world at the time. But we only have preserved for us the copy that he sent to the Romans, or in the case of Hebrews, the copy that was sent to the Hebrews. The copy that was sent to the Hebrews actually might be somewhat more unique, but the book of Romans, we have only the copy that was sent to the Romans. But I believe that it stands to reason that he didn't just write this wonderful exposition work and send it to the Romans and then, shelve it. To the contrary, I'm not even sure that the Romans were the first to receive a copy of it. I think that it was like a form letter. He added to the beginning a to and a from, and he adds to the end a few goodbyes and addresses to various individuals in Rome. But the text of the book of Romans, starting around, and I'm going by memory here, somewhere around verse 16 or so of chapter 1, is actually a book. I mean, it could just be published as a book by itself without the aspect of it that was written to the Romans. Another kind of letter that Paul writes in his books, if you will, is his letters are responses, and these are parts of a dialogue that Paul is carrying on with the congregation in various areas. They're not his first contact with them. They're not even, in most cases, his second or third contact with them. And he is oftentimes addressing a situation or a false theology that is being taught in that particular congregation is dealing with. Let's put it that way. And there's a crisis in that congregation, and he's addressing it. So there's sort of a 3-way dialogue taking place at times. There's Paul, there's the congregation he's addressing, and then there's some third party out there that is apparently also taking place in the debate that's also been addressing, and Paul would say, troubling that congregation. And this is the setting for the book of Galatians. And so it's helpful to kind of understand what's happening in the book of Galatians. And we're going to seek to understand the book of Galatians as we understood the book of Romans from a Jewish perspective, in continuity with Second Temple Judaism, from the Aramaic text, using Jewish hermeneutics, and as I said, continuity with Second Temple era Judaism, which is really key to understanding the book of Galatians. So as I understand it, Paul had sent to the Galatians a book virtually identical to our book of Romans. And so the Galatians had read this book, and they were familiar with it, and they were familiar with the arguments in it. And in the book of Galatians, Paul will reference those arguments, but he won't repeat them in their entirety. He will assume that they're already known, and that simply by referencing them, he has brought to the mind of his reader the entire argument that he made earlier in the book of Romans. Paul appears to be addressing a third party that is troubling the Galatians. And that third party appears to have sent the Galatians a letter or document, very much like a document that we have recovered in the Dead Sea Scrolls. In fact, maybe a virtually verbatim copy of that document. That document is called, technically it's called 4QMMT. In English, it's Some of the Works of the Law. So called a sectarian manifesto. Now, in order to understand Galatians, it will be helpful to have an understanding of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, we'll do a teaching someday, I hope, if time allows, on some of the primary Dead Sea Scrolls and how they relate in Second Temple era Judaism to the Nazarenes. But for now, it would be helpful to have a translation of the Dead Sea Scrolls, or the primary documents thereof. I like this one I've had for many years in my library by Weiss, Abegg, and Cook, this English edition. To the Dead Sea Scrolls, a new translation. I think this is probably the first edition, like I said, I've had for years. I think it's gone through several editions since then, and so my copy won't be exactly like yours, but it's got some good stuff in it. And today, or at least in our study of Galatians, we're going to be referencing a document commonly known as the Damascus document, and that's the very first document in this book. So there'll be some reference to the Damascus document, and there'll be some references to a document called, the document known as 4QMMT, which is listed in this book as, let's see if I can find it real quick in the table, a sectarian manifesto is what they call it, 4QMMT, or 4Q 394 through 4Q 399, technical catalog designations for those particular documents. All right, so that's the setting for the book of Galatians. We're looking at one part of, like hearing one side of a phone call, only it's really a phone call or a dialogue that's taking place between three individuals or three groups. The Galatians, and particularly I assume the overseer of Galatia, who's receiving this letter primarily and going to pass it along, and the elders of Galatia at the very least. The representative of the works of the law sect of the Essenes, who are represented by the document known as 4QMMT, and we'll learn more about that, and Paul. So Paul has sent the Galatian community a copy of the book of Romans. It's come to Paul's attention, apparently, and I'm reading between the lines here of Galatians, but it's come to Paul's attention that they've apparently been sent a copy of 4QMMT by, or some of the works of the law, by an Essene missionary, if you will, an Essene counterpart to Paul. Paul's trying to bring the Nazarene message to them. This individual is trying to bring what I would call a radical Essene message to them. This radical Essene group, the works of the law group of the Essenes, believed that they could reach righteousness, a level of righteousness, and they could have justification and righteousness through what they called the works of the law, which were a group of purity regulations about which they felt that the other Jews, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, were too lax. And because they were too lax, they had polluted the temple and they had polluted Israel, and that the justification could be achieved by purification through keeping these purity regulations that they called the works of the law. All right, so that's a little introduction to who these people were, or what, I'm sorry, not who they were, but what the dialogue that was taking place. Let's now talk for a moment about who the Galatians were. Your first handout is titled, Who Were the Galatians? That's very interesting and a very key issue. Halley's Bible Handbook on page 608 says, Galatians were a branch of Gauls, originally from north of the Black Sea, split off from the main migration westward to France, and settled in Asia Minor in the 3rd century BC. That's Halley's Bible Handbook, page 608. And that is absolutely correct insofar as it goes. The Galatians are, or the Gauls were a group. The Galatians were a colony of Gauls, and the Gauls are a group that originally traced back to an area north of the Black Sea. That's the first place that history recognizes them, I will say. And they migrated all the way across the continent from there, across Asia Minor, which is what we now know as Turkey, into Europe, and all the way to France, which was in ancient times known as Gaul. And in fact, if you've got the Hebraic roots version of the scriptures, in the back we have a map titled, the very first map I believe it is, it's titled The Ancient World as Known to the Hebrews. You probably can't see this on the video, but there's the map. And if you look on the very edge of the map, all the way here in on the edge of Europe, it says Gaul. Okay, Gaul was where France was. Now, the Gauls were also known as the Celts, which is why the language of the Celts is known as Gaelic or Gaulish. And so they migrated also across the English Channel and into the British Isles and became the Irish and Scottish people. Okay, that's just a quick picture of who the Gauls were. And I'm kind of jumping the gun a little bit. Well, no, I'm not, because I haven't really connected the Gauls. This is historically who the Gauls were. Okay, historians, everybody agrees that's who the Gauls were. Now, let's back up a little bit and get a little biblical perspective on who the Gauls were. The Gauls were this area north of the Black Sea, is where they originated historically before they migrated across Turkey, or Asia Minor, what we call now Turkey. And they settled there. They created a colony there called Galatia. And this is the Galatians that are being written to in the book of Galatians. In the book of Obadiah, chapter 1, verse 20, we read, And the captivity of this host of the children of Israel are among the Canaanites, even unto Zarphat. And the captivity of Jerusalem that is in Sepharad shall possess the cities of the south. So here we learn that Judah would be dispersed, the house of Judah would be dispersed to, among other places, a place called Sepharad. That's Spain. It's what we call Sephardic Jews. Okay? But we're told that the house of Israel, at least in part, would be dispersed to a place called Zarphat. Now we might ask ourselves, what does Zarphat in Obadiah 1:20 mean? What is this place? And Rashi's commentary on Obadiah 1:20 says Zarphat is the kingdom of France. And in fact, one of the Latin words for France is Gallia, which is Gaul. Okay, Gaul is also Gallia. Gallia, I believe, can be shown to have been the Galileans. Okay, the Galileans, members of the house of Israel, of the lost 10 tribes, they were exiled to Assyria by the Assyrians. And if you actually read where they were exiled, it was an area just north of Assyria. Some of these migrated up north of the Black Sea, and they became known as the Gauls, and then they migrated across Asia Minor. And in fact, the Galatians are mentioned by Kepha in, I wasn't going to go here, but let me do it real quick. In Kepha's letter, in Kepha's first letter, by the way, chapter 1, verse 1, Peter, an emissary of Yeshua the Messiah, to the chosen and sojourners who were scattered in Pontus and Galatia and Cappadocia and in Asia and in Bithynia. Okay, so he talks about the chosen and sojourners who are scattered in, among other places, Galatia. Now, if we compare that with the opening line of the book of Yaakov, or Jacob, it says, Jacob, a servant of Eloah and our Adon, Yeshua the Messiah, to the 12 tribes who were scattered among the nations. If we take these two as parallels, then it appears that Galatia is one of the places that the 12 tribes, or 10 of the 12 tribes, ended up. Okay, so the Galatians were from the 10 lost tribes. There's a very good case to be made for that. So now let's start with the book of Galatians, chapter 1. And we'll start here in verse 1. Paul, an emissary, not from the sons of men, and not by the hand of a son of man, but by the hand of Yeshua the Messiah and Eloah his Father, who raised him from among the dead. And all the brothers that are with me to the assemblies that are in Galatia. By the way, there's more than one. Galatia is pretty large. Favor and shalom be with you from Eloah the Father and from our Adon, Yeshua the Messiah. By the way, this is the book of Galatians. What language do you think it was written in? Of course, I maintain it was written in Aramaic. I believe all of Paul's letters were written in Hebrew and Aramaic. There are those who say, oh, well, Paul wrote in Greek because he wrote in the language to people in the languages which were their languages. But if that's the case, he would have written following that logic, he would have written to the Galatians in Gaulish and to the Romans in Latin, which is ridiculous, of course. So the book of Galatians wasn't written in Gaelic or Gaulish, it was written in Aramaic. Who gave his nephesh for our sins, that he might deliver us from this evil world according to the will of Eloah the Father. To him be the glory forever and ever. Amen. I am amazed how quickly you are being turned from the Messiah who called you by his favor to another good news, or another gospel, which is not a good news. However, there are some which are troubling to you and desire to pervert the good news of the Messiah. So he's now addressing this third party out there that is has entered the discussions, if you will, and he's saying that there's this group out there that has troubled you with this other false good news, or other false basora, false gospel, if you will. Now also, if we or an angel from heaven should proclaim in part from what we have proclaimed, that if anyone proclaims to you apart from what you have received, he should be accursed. For now do I persuade the sons of men, or Eloah? Or do I seek to please the sons of men? For if until now I had pleased the sons of men, I would not have been a servant of the Messiah. But I make known to you, my brothers, that the good news which was proclaimed from me was not from a son of man, not of man, it was of divine origin. For I also did not from a son of man receive it or learn it, but from the revelation of Yeshua the Messiah. For you have heard of my way of life. What he's doing, he's sort of setting up a contrast here, because his opponent will ascribe what they've learned to a figure called the teacher of righteousness. Okay, his opponent, the radical Essene works of the law group. Now, there's a false interpretation, by the way, of the book of Galatians that has gone around the Hebraic roots movement. There's two false interpretations I'm familiar with. One is, first of all, the obvious one that circulates in Christianity, that Paul's opponent is simply Judaism, Torah-observant Judaism, and that Paul is trying to teach them a new and different, a new and different religion called Christianity. That's, of course, a totally false interpretation of the book. The next false interpretation of the book is that Paul is some kind of neo-Kyrite out of his time, and that Paul's, despite the fact that Paul says in Acts, I am a Pharisee, and that Paul's opponent is Pharisaic Judaism or Rabbinic Judaism, and in his opponent's doctrine is the oral law. This is way out there. There's no real basis for it. In fact, the phrase works of the law, which is repeated throughout the letter, and we'll talk about this more later, never shows up in the rabbinic writings at all. It shows up in only one place. One, Paul's writings, and two, the one document, some of the works of the law, 4QMMT, that's shown up in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And there's a lot more evidence that 4QMMT, as we'll find out later in our study, is in fact the doctrine that Paul is dealing with here. For you have heard of my way of life that you were from before, which was in Judaism. Now, Paul's not contrasting his past life in Judaism with his current life in Christianity, which is the traditional Christian interpretation of this verse. Because in Acts, he says in the present tense, I am a Pharisee. So what he's doing is he's comparing his past life in Judaism with his current life in Judaism. And I especially persecuted the assembly of Elohim and was destroying it. And I excelled in Judaism more than many of my peers who were my countrymen, and I was especially zealous in the teaching of my fathers. And when I pleased that one who was not set me apart from the womb of my mother, and called me of his favor, to reveal his Son in me, that I should proclaim him among the Goyim, I did not immediately reveal this to flesh and blood. Okay, so Paul had a background in Pharisaic Judaism. As we know from other passages and material, he was a student of Gamaliel, the grandson of Hillel. Had Paul not had the road to Damascus experience, Paul might well have, in fact, almost certainly would have been one of the sages of Pharisaic Judaism that we would be reading quotes from and reading the arguments of in the Mishnah. But that's not what happened. And so, but that's who Paul was, where he came from. And that becomes important in the interpretation of this text. Verse 16, he says, to reveal his Son that I should proclaim among the Goyim. Now, we talked in our book, in our study of Romans, about what that message to the Goyim means. But I want to address this idea of Paul as a unique messenger to the Goyim. And, of course, there are implications of that tying it to the house of Israel and the 10 lost tribes that we talked about in our study of the book of Romans. But the ancient Nazarenes did in fact recognize Paul and his mission as an emissary to the house of Israel and to the Goyim. This distinguishes, by the way, among other issues, the Nazarenes from the Ebionites. Some scholars like to confuse the two and misidentify the Nazarenes and Ebionites as being different names for the same group. There are a number of distinguishing features between the two, and in fact history tells us in the writings of the so-called church fathers that the Ebionites split off from the Nazarenes. Okay? And we discussed that, I believe, in our last study somewhat, in our study of the book of Romans. We have an ancient Nazarene commentary on Isaiah that has come down to us. One of the few ancient Nazarene writings that has survived to us. We don't have the whole thing, just about 5 quotes from it, which are preserved in the writings of the so-called church father Jerome, who in his commentary to Isaiah occasionally makes reference to the Nazarene, this ancient Nazarene commentary on Isaiah. And this ancient Nazarene commentary on Isaiah says, the Nazarenes who accept Messiah in such a way that they do not cease to observe. Oh, this is one of your handouts, by the way. Proclaim him among the Goyim or Gentiles, Galatians 1:16. Okay. The ancient Nazarene commentary says on Isaiah says, the Nazarenes who accept the Messiah in such a way that they do not cease to observe the old law explain the two houses of Isaiah 8:14, I believe. The two houses that will make him make both the houses stumble. Explain the two houses as the two families of Shammai and Hillel, from whom originate the scribes and Pharisees. Akiba, who took over their school, is called the master of Aquila the proselyte, and after him came Meir, who was then succeeded by Johannes, the son of Zakkai, and after him Eleazar, and further Telphon, probably Tarphon, and next Joseph Galius and Joshua, up to the capture of Jerusalem. Shammai then and Hillel were born not long before the Lord. They originated in Judea. The name of the first means scatterer, and the second unholy. Now they don't really mean that, but he's making a word play on their names, attacking not Hillel and Shammai themselves, but the school of Hillel and the school of Shammai as the Nazarene competitor, if you will, because he scattered and defiled the precepts of the Torah by his traditions, and Judaize. And these are the two houses that did not accept the Savior, who has become to them ruin and scandal. That word Judaize means a repetition. It could be translated Mishnah. Now, I want to clarify 2 things here. First of all, the Nazarene commentary is not giving the shot of this passage, Isaiah 14. It's a midrash. It's an allegorical interpretation of the passage. And in this allegorical interpretation of the passage, the literal 2 houses are obviously the house of Israel and the house of Judah. But in the allegorical interpretation that he's giving, the 2 houses are the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai. Okay. There's 2 things that are important to us. One, the midrash is not identifying an allegory to the 2 houses themselves, but to the stumbling. In other words, the stumbling of the 2 houses, not the 2 houses themselves. The midrash is not attacking Hillel and Shammai themselves, but the houses of Hillel and Shammai, because they stumbled in not accepting the Messiah. Hillel and Shammai weren't even born yet. Well, they were born, but when the time that Hillel and Shammai died, Yeshua was a child. So it's not Hillel and Shammai themselves that are being discussed here. All right. That being said, it establishes that we are talking about Midrash here. So then the commentary goes on in the commentary to Isaiah chapter 9, verses 1 through 4, or chapter 8, verses 23 through 9:3 in Jewish versions. Jerome writes this. He says, "The Nazarenes, whose opinion I have set forth above, try to explain this passage in the following way. When the Messiah came and his proclaiming shone out, the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, first of all, were freed from the errors of the scribes and Pharisees, and he shook off their shoulders the very heavy yoke of the Jewish traditions. Later, however, the proclaiming became more dominant. That means the proclaiming was multiplied through the good news of the emissary Paul, who was the least of all the emissaries. And the good news of Messiah shone to the most distant tribes and the way of the whole sea. Finally, the whole world, which earlier walked or sat in darkness, was imprisoned in the bonds of idolatry and death, has seen the clear light of the good news." So Paul is seen as being the prophetic fulfillment of this increase of light that happens after the time of the Messiah. Now, if we look at Isaiah chapter 9, verses 1 through 4, we'll see that it refers to Galilee of the Goyim. Now, remember we said that the Gauls, or the Galatians, were called the Galilees. They were the Galileans. Okay? They were the descendants of the Galileans. But notice that these Gentiles are the inhabitants of the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, which is again reference to the 10 lost tribes, or 2 of the 10 lost tribes. Okay, so these Goyim, these Gentiles, are really the house of Israel, and we covered this in a lot more detail when we talked about Romans chapters 9 through 11 in the Romans video series. So the house of Israel is being identified as Gentiles. Okay, and the Nazarene commentary on Isaiah understands the phrase, "You have multiplied the nation" in Isaiah 9:3 as actually a prophecy about Paul, and that Paul has multiplied the good news, or would multiply the good news, to the most distant tribes, quote unquote. Okay? Therefore, the ancient Nazarenes understood Paul as an emissary to the Gentiles, but as such, as actually an emissary, the Gentiles in question being the 10 lost tribes. So, I hope that helps us understand verse 16. So Paul is saying, I am an emissary to the Gentiles, okay, but the Gentiles in question are the Galileans of Isaiah chapter 9, and the Galileans are the Galatians, okay? The Galatians are Galileans. All right, and I did not go to Jerusalem to the emissaries who were before me, but I went to Arabia and again returned to Damascus. After 3 years, I went to Jerusalem to see Kepha and remained with him 15 days. Okay? There's a lot here. Paul was from a Pharisaic background. He knew Pharisaic Judaism inside out. He knew the teachings of Hillel, the teachings of the house of Hillel, and the house of Shammai. He was familiar with all of that. He was very well studied and a student of Gamaliel, as we said. But he was not an expert on Essenism, at least not at that time. So Paul's writing the Galatians. He's wanting to drive home the point that he knows what he's talking about. Not only is he an expert in Phariseeism from his background there, But something else happened that caused him to also become an expert in Essenism. So he is going to show us that he knows what he's talking about. Now, notice it says Damascus. This reference to Damascus, verse 17. Now, what's important about Damascus? In Acts chapter 7, Paul, when he was going out to seek out the followers of the Way and this new movement of followers of Yeshua, he went to Damascus to go try and wipe them out. Now, why Damascus? Why was Damascus such an important place to go to wipe out these early followers of the Messiah that were known as, in Acts chapter 7, the Way? Well, the answer is to be found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, in that document called the Damascus document. Now, unfortunately, I didn't create a handout for this because unfortunately it's scattered throughout the document. Scattered references. So putting it all together would require writing a paper or just studying the Damascus document. But what the Damascus document tells us, among other things, is that when the Essenes originated, they were followers of this individual called the Teacher of Righteousness. And when they originated, they all followed the Teacher of Righteousness to Damascus. They made sort of an exodus or an exile from Judea and from Judah and from Jerusalem. And they all went to Damascus, and when they got to Damascus, they entered into a covenant with one another. And this covenant they entered into with one another, they considered to be the new covenant, the renewed covenant that Jeremiah 31 speaks of. So they believed they were living in the new covenant, the renewed covenant. And the renewed covenant was the covenant that bound them together as Essenes. And for the 4Q MMT crowd, the works of the law was a foundational aspect of this new covenant that they were bound together, by which they were bound together. Okay. Now I want to address the issue of 3 years. Why does it say 3 years in Damascus? I do have a handout that covers a little bit of this. The next handout is 3 years and Damascus, Galatians 1, 17 through 18. Now, we already mentioned in Acts, I said Acts 7, but it's actually Acts 9, sorry, that Paul says, now Paul was yet full of the threat of anger, of murder, in the first two verses of Acts chapter 9. It says, now Paul was yet full of the threat of anger, of murder against the Talmudim of Aradon. And he asked for letters from the chief Kohen to be given to Damascus, to the synagogues, that if he should find any who follow in this way, men or women, that he might bind and bring them to Jerusalem. Now, in the Damascus document and in many of the other Dead Sea Scrolls, the Essenes refer to their movement as the Way. In fact, the Essenes also quote Isaiah chapter 40, where it talks about a way being made in the wilderness. The same verse that Yochanan, the immerser, John the Baptist, quotes, okay, to describe his ministry. So there's this, the Damascus was the birthplace of Essenism, okay? Now, this is a whole different study, but there is very good evidence to indicate that the very first followers of Yeshua many of them were Essenes, and that this was very early on a movement from within Essenism. And in fact, John the Baptist, Yochanan, was in fact an Essene and led an objective outside source would definitely see as an Essene sect. Okay, so let's keep that in mind. So we get then to Galatians chapter 1, verses 17 through 18, as we mentioned, and here we read that Paul, after he became a believer in Messiah and he went to Damascus, how long did he stay there? 3 years in Damascus, when he sought out the way there, and on his way to seek out the way, while he was there, he had this experience on the road to Damascus. So when he gets there, instead of fighting them, he allies himself with them. Frankly, he joins them. Okay? And in doing so, he's, at this point, early stage of the game, he's joining what are effectively a group of Essenes. Okay? And so, how did one join the Essenes? In Flavius Josephus' document, Wars of the Jews, Flavius Josephus was a first century Jewish Roman historian. And he writes, "But now, if anyone has a mind to come over to their sect," talking about the Essenes, "he is not immediately admitted, but he is prescribed the same method of living which they use for a year." So for a year, he lives among them the way they live. While he continues excluded, in other words, he's really not part of the community, but he lives with them and lives the way they live. While he continues excluded, and they give him also a small hatchet and a aforementioned girdle and the white garment. So they gave him clothing and a hatchet. And when he is given evidence during that time that he can observe their countenance, and he approaches nearer to their way of living and is made a partaker of the waters of purification, a water baptism. Yet is he not even now admitted to live with them, for after this demonstration of his fortitude, his temper is tried 2 more years. And if he appears to be worthy, they then admit him into their society. So to enter into the Essene society was a 3-year process. 1 year you spent as an outsider among them, okay? And then after you proved that you could live among them, you still had to go 2 more years after you were baptized before you were considered, I use the term baptized, you underwent water immersion, tevilah. You went 2 more years before you could be considered a full-fledged Essene. So Paul is telling us here in Galatians, if we understand then, this is what I'm talking about, understanding the continuity of Second Temple era Judaism. When he went to Damascus, he was there for 3 years. He's not pulling the 3 years out of a hat. He's letting his audience know, I went through the whole process. I learned Essenism. I became an officially. I went through the process, and I was accepted as a part of even of the community. So I know what I'm talking about when I talk about these issues. Okay. By the way, the Torah reading is on a 3-year cycle, so a proselyte takes 3 years to learn the entire Torah, if you will, in becoming a proselyte. So there's a traditional idea that a proselyte would take 3 years in ancient times, and that 3 years he was studying the Torah. Of course, that's following the triennial cycle, because that was anciently they had a 3-year cycle. So if a person was required to study and learn the whole Torah before becoming a proselyte, which they were, it was a 3-year process. Likewise, it was a 3-year process to become an Essene if you were already in, say, Pharisaic Judaism. So Paul, during that 3 years, went through all the Torah readings as they were taught in the way, in the Essene society, and learned the Essene understanding of the entire Torah during those 3 years. And Paul is invoking that to his audience here in the book of Galatians. He's letting them know, not only do I know Pharisaic Judaism very well, not only do I know the halakha, not only do I know the teachings of Hillel and Shammai and so on, I also know the teachings of the teacher of righteousness and the Moreh Tzaddik and the teachings of Essenism quite well. Okay, verse 19. And I did not see the other emissaries except Yaakov, the brother of Ardon. Now these things I write to you before Eloah, I do not lie. And these things and after these things I came to the regions of Syria of Cilicia. And the assemblies in Yehuda that were in the Messiah did not know me personally, but this only they had heard. He who from before persecuted us, now behold, he is proclaiming the trust that from before time he had cast down, and they glorified Eloah by me. Now after 14 years, chapter 2, verse 1, after 14 years I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas, and took with me Titus. But I went up by revelation, and I made known to them the good news that I was proclaiming among the Goyim. And I showed to those who were considered to be something among them, lest vainly I had run or would run. Even Titus that was with me, who was an Aramaean, the Greek version says that he was Greek, but the Aramaic version says that he was an Aramaean or Syrian, was not compelled to be circumcised. Because of this, false brothers who entered in among us, that they might spy on a freedom that we have in Yeshua the Messiah, thus to enslave us. Let me pause there for a moment. Our next handout is Galatians 2:3. This phrase, that Titus was not compelled to be circumcised, is really taken wrongly and misinterpreted by Christians. The key word here is compelled. Compelled. The word compelled in the Aramaic is itanos, literally to be forced. And it comes from a root word in Aramaic meaning to act violently. The Greek has a similar meaning if you do a study on the Greek word. So it also means to be forced. So the text is telling us not that Titus wasn't circumcised, but that Titus was not circumcised by force. By implication, in other words, that he was circumcised voluntarily. Why specify that he wasn't circumcised by force if he wasn't circumcised at all? Titus was in fact circumcised, and in fact Timothy at the same time was circumcised, if we look at Acts chapter 15 and 16. Okay. What's important to realize is that there was something known as forced circumcision. And what we read about forced circumcision in 1 Maccabees chapter 2, verses 45 through 46 in the Apocrypha. It says, Then Mattathias, who was the leader of the Maccabees before he died and then Judas Maccabee took over, then Mattathias and his friends went round about and pulled down the altars to the false gods. And what children soever they found within the coasts of Israel uncircumcised, those they circumcised by force. They circumcised by force. They compelled them to be circumcised. Now, the context here in the book of Maccabees is that Antiochus Epiphanes had outlawed circumcision. And so the Jewish people were prohibited from circumcising their children. And if a woman did circumcise her children, what they would do is they would kill the child, her infant. They would tie the infant around her neck, according to the books of the Maccabees. They would parade her around the city of Jerusalem, walking around the city, stumbling around the city of Jerusalem with her own infant tied around her neck until she couldn't do it anymore. She couldn't walk anymore. And when she was so tired that she finally couldn't walk anymore, then they threw her over the city wall and she was killed. Okay. So this was a very serious law against circumcision, and the death penalty for both the child and mother was in effect, not to mention anyone else, father, moel, or whatever. Okay. And so what Mattathias Maccabee and his sons, which included Judas Maccabee, were doing is they would ride down, they were fighting this guerrilla warfare with the Romans. What they would do is they would ride down into a Jewish community and they would forcibly circumcise all the children in this Jewish community by force. And then they would leave. Well, I say the Romans, it wasn't Romans, obviously, it was the Greco-Syrians. When the Greco-Syrians showed up later and all the children in this village were circumcised, everyone would say, we couldn't help it, we had no choice. The Maccabees came in and they forcibly circumcised all the children. And of course, then there would be no penalty. You can't penalize them because they had no choice. Okay, so that's the context of the event. But the result was that this was the creation, the concept of something known as forced circumcision or compelled circumcision, which Paul was against. And so Paul made very clear that he's against this. It's very possible that his opponent was for it. And Paul is emphasizing that Titus was circumcised voluntarily and not by force. Okay, so now we are in verse 5. Also, not for 1 hour did we submit to their oppression, that the truth of the good news might remain to you. Now those that were considered to be something, but what they were was not of concern to me. But on the contrary, for they saw that I had been entrusted with the good news, or the Besorah, of the uncircumcision, like Kepha had been entrusted by the circumcision. Now, this doesn't mean that they stayed uncircumcised. We covered that in the book of Romans. But Paul was reaching out to people, evangelizing people that were not circumcised, whereas Kepha was evangelizing people that were already circumcised. For he who worked in Kepha in the emissaryship of the circumcision also worked in me in the emissaryship of the Goyim. And when they knew the favor that was given to me, Yaakov and Kepha and Yochanan, those who were considered to be pillars, gave the right hand of fellowship to me and to Barnabas, and we proclaim among the Goyim, and they among the circumcision. They only asked that we remember the poor, and it was also a concern to me that I do this. But when Kepha came to Antioch, I reproved him to his face, because they were caused to stumble by him. Now, we have to understand what this verse is saying in the next verse, because it's so misunderstood by Christians and their misinterpretation of the passage. Getting a Jewish understanding of this passage from the Aramaic is very important. Before men came from toward, now you see it says from toward, that is in the Aramaic a double preposition. We never use double prepositions in English. It's very bad English to use double prepositions, but it's very good Aramaic. Okay, so it says before me men came from toward. It doesn't say that they came from Yaakov, which would imply that Yaakov sent them, but that they came from toward Yaakov, which could mean that they were standing near Yaakov, or it could mean that they were of the same persuasion of Yaakov, but it doesn't mean that Yaakov sent them. It distances that with this double preposition from toward Yaakov. He ate with the Goyim, but when they came, he withdrew his nephesh and separated because of fear from those who were from the circumcision. And the rest of the Judeans also submitted to this with him. Thus even Barnabas was led to reject them by their face. Okay, there's a misunderstanding that somehow this means Kepha was eating unkosher food, and he stopped eating the unkosher food with the Gentiles and suddenly started acting all Jewish when these men showed up. But that's not what the passage is saying at all. And when I saw that they were not walking correctly in the truth of the good news, I said to Kepha in front of them all, if you who are a Judean, or a Jew, lives as an Aramaean and not as a Judean, how do you compel the Goyim to live as Judeans? Okay, this is, by the way, where the Christians get the idea of Judaizing. And in fact, Paul's opponents in the book of Galatians are understood by the main line of Christianity to be the Judaizers, which really makes no sense as we start to understand what's transpiring here. Kepha's being a racist. Okay, not necessarily intentionally, subconsciously, but he's hanging out with the Gentiles in Antioch, and then Syrians, and then when Jewish people show up, he suddenly moves over to the Jewish people, the table with his Jewish friends, and Paul scolds him and tells him, Elohim does not judge people by their face. He's not a respecter of persons. We don't act that way. Aramaeans act that way. We don't act that way. Our Torah tells us not to act that way. And that's a whole other teaching. But that's what is transpiring here. And Kepha screwed up, because Kepha wasn't perfect. And Paul is pointing out, I even took the opportunity, even stood up and said, you did the wrong thing here, when he did the wrong thing. But it had nothing to do with observing Torah or not observing Torah. It had to do with acting in a discriminatory, prejudicial manner. And when it says here, to live as Judeans, compel the Goyim to live as Judeans, the Greek word there is Judaize. Our next handout is, what do you mean Judaize? Galatians 2:14. What do you mean Judaize? Most Christians have taken Judaizers, like I said, to be Paul's opponents, but that's not the context here. And sadly, I've even seen people in the Messianic movement, the Hebraic roots movement, that bring that baggage along with them and still think that. It's still, let's find out, what does the word Judaizer really mean? Well, here it's live as Jews. The term Judaizer in the Greek, it's Judaizo, comes from, as I said, Galatians 2:14. It also appears in Esther 8:17, where we're told that in the wake of the Jewish victory of Purim, in the book of Esther, that many of the Persians who witnessed this great event chose to convert to Judaism, and so we're told in Esther 8:17 that they, quote, became Jews. Okay, the Greek word where it says became Jews in the Greek Septuagint version is they Judaized. Okay. Josephus uses this term. Josephus writes of the Roman commander Metilius, who was commander of the Roman garrison in Jerusalem. He writes that he saved his life by entreaties and promises to Judaize and even to be circumcised. So Judaize means, the term Judaize actually meant, and elsewhere Josephus tells us, by the way, that the Syrians thought that they had brought the Jews to ruin. They had the Judaizers in suspicion also. To Judaize in Greek means originally to convert to Judaism. That's what a Judaizer was. A Judaizer was someone who had become Jewish. It wasn't something you did to someone else. It was something you did to yourself. A Judaizer was a person who had made the choice to become a Jew, as in Esther 8:17. So let's look at Galatians 2:14, and right now we'll look at it from the Greek to get the context. I, Paul, because that's where the word Judaize appears. I, Paul, said to Kepha before them all, if you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you compel the Gentiles to Judaize? Now that's interesting, because Paul isn't criticizing, or actually he's not Judaizing, for compelling the Gentiles to Judaize. Because Paul can't Judaize, Kepha can't Judaize. Kepha's already Jewish. But he's compelling the Gentiles to Judaize. Okay? And Paul is not complaining about that. He has no. If you read the context, Paul is not concerned or upset that Kepha is Judaizing. Paul, said to Kepha before them all, if you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you compel the Gentiles to Judaize? He's not complaining that he's compelling the Gentiles to Judaize. He's complaining that Kepha is not living like a Jew himself. That's what his complaint is. And by living by a Jew, he means treating all people the same. Because that's what Judaism teaches us. Okay? The word Judaize came to be a dirty word, if you will. In fact, it's really kind of anti-Semitic, the way the word is used. You see, to Christianize is okay. To Gentilize is fine. But to Judaize is like dirty and evil. Interesting, the attitude to Judaizing versus to Christianize or to Gentilize. Like being Jewish is bad, dirty. Ignatius of Antioch uses the term and do a whole teaching on Ignatius of Antioch. He basically was the founder of modern antinomian Christianity. And he writes in his Magnesians, chapter 3, verses 1, 8, and 11. This is his letter to the Magnesians. Be not deceived with strange doctrines, nor with old fables that are unprofitable, for if we still continue to live according to the Jewish laws, we do not confess ourselves to have received grace. And then he says in verse 8, let us learn to live according to the rules of Christianity, which is a term he coined. The word Christian appears in the 3 times in the scriptures, but the word Christianity never does, because it wasn't the name of a religion. For it was in the New Testament, the so-called New Testament, in the Ketuvim Nazarene, the term Christian was actually a derogatory term that Gentile believers in Messiah were being called. Let us learn to live according to the rules of Christianity, for whoever is called by any other name besides this, he is not of God. And then in verse 11 he says, it is absurd to name Jesus Christ and to Judaize, for the Christian religion did not embrace the Jewish, but the Jewish the Christian. So it's Ignatius who invented the idea that to Judaize was evil. It's not found in Galatians chapter 2, verse 14 at all, because in Galatians 2:14, it's only passively mentioned. As a matter of fact, that Kepha was teaching Gentiles to Judaize. It's not a wrong thing, and in fact, the wrong thing wasn't that he was teaching Gentiles to Judaize, it's that he wasn't acting Jewish himself. Okay? We're going to go ahead and stop there. We're going to pick up on verse 15, chapter 2, verse 15, in part 2, and through the book of Galatians. So I hope you'll join us next time as we continue our study of the book of Galatians in chapter 2, beginning with verse 15. Shalom.